Welcome back to the Clinical Athlete Podcast. If you're not familiar with Clinical Athlete, we're a network of healthcare providers, students, and coaches who specialize in the management of athletes. You can find your nearest Clinical Athlete provider at clinicalathlete.com. We also have the Clinical Athlete Forum, where we discuss and share ideas and resources related to athlete health and performance. To join the forum, or for a potential listing on the Clinical Athlete directory, and for all upcoming seminars, webinars, and events, details can be found on the website. This podcast can also be found on our website, along with YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. If the platform that you use allows you to rate the show, we'd appreciate you taking the time to do that so that we can get the info out to as many people as possible. My name is Quinn. I'm a doctor of physical therapy in Orange County, California at Clinical Athlete Newport. On this show, we're joined by co-host Jared Maynard, who is the Clinical Athlete Continuing Education Director and Coordinator and a physiotherapist at Depth Physiotherapy in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. He is also a strength coach and runs an online powerlifting coaching company and is a competitive powerlifter himself. And we have our other co-host, John Flagg, who is an athletic trainer and the powerlifting, weightlifting, and strongman coach at 301 Strong in White Plains, Maryland, and the owner of Rebuild Stronger, an online coaching platform for strength athletes. He is also a clinical athlete provider and lead instructor of the Clinical Athlete Powerlifting Certification. We are also very happy to welcome onto the show Jackson Taylor, who is a physical therapist in Connecticut. This is part 2 of our 2-part series in which we discuss some existential questions that we've all probably had. Why did we choose our profession? How does our character impact our ability to succeed professionally? What are the actionable steps we can take to better reflect on our character and what our given purpose is in life? It's a great conversation with Jackson, and we hope you enjoy it. I'm looking at a research article that I had saved that the title is Seeing Everyone Else's Highlight Reels, How Facebook Usage is Linked to Depressive Symptoms. Read that. It's actually an interesting read. Yeah.
You mentioned, real quick, just about that happiness thing. And you had mentioned earlier, what is enough? And I think a lot of people use like how much you earn as enough. Like once I make this much money or once I make that much money. And I can say this just from recent personal experience that I feel so much better with my life choices over the last year because I know, you talked about your little sister. I know my little girls are going to be able to tell their kids stories about me because I'm around. Yeah. And that's been a big shift, not just for me, but for my family. And that's, when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, those are the decisions you have to make. Like, who are you trying to please? And what is really enough? Yeah. When you sit down and you really think about it, and this is where it came for me, I don't give a crap about myself that much. I worry about my little girls, what they're going to tell their kids, and how, like, my grandfather had a huge impact on my life. And I still tell people stories about what he meant to me. I want my grandkids and their kids to be impacted by that. And if you can boil it all the way down to that, which is hard, because you do have to go through like all the ego stuff, which we'll talk about, like, well, I want to be this, or I want to be that, or I want to mean this to people. And really, especially with Instagram and all the other stuff that's out there, is that even worth your time? Like, what is that meaning? Is that a shallow meaning? No, like, when I'm done and we're on some other form of social media 50 years from now, where they're just probably blasting pictures into your brain, you don't even need a screen in front of you. Like, nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna care. So,
but the people that do care are your girls.
Yeah.
I think that's something, and the biggest part about that is that has nothing to do with what other people see. And I think that's where the ego thing comes in, is where, and that's something that I am so guilty of on so many levels, is doing things because I want other people to validate me. And it's just not what it's about. Like, you miss, like, I've loved, like I said, giving up like the social media stuff. It's amazing how much more time I spend like calling my family or reading about things that I think are going to benefit me, or spending more time with a patient when instead I could have been like setting up a video to show some whatever. Like it's amazing how when you start prioritizing like what's important, like is your social media and your image so important that you're willing to sacrifice something else? And I always, I've come to kind of this conclusion in my own mind is that our life is a big budget, right? Just like we budget money. So yes, there is some truth to say, like, if I'm posting images of whatever, it's going to help people. I'm Jared Hall and I'm getting all this great info out. That is fantastic and it's wonderful. I'm not saying that he's this way. I'm just giving an example. But what does that detract from somewhere else? Because you can't just give something, but you're going to have to take a deposit somewhere else. I gave the same example when we did this the other day, talking about, I don't know if it was dry needling or whatever it was. If it helps somebody, even if I told them maybe a fib or whatever about whatever this was going to do, but they got better. Yes, you're right. You did help them. But did you have to withdraw from your character to put that there? Did you have to become fraudulent to do something somewhere else? Again, did you help somebody? Sure, and that's a good thing. We would never argue that. But does it take away from who you are as a person? Did you lose some trust from people because you decided to make a decision over here? Even on Level Up the other night, I was talking to, his name's Cash, about that topic. We were like, well, would I tell somebody a narrative that was, a little bit of a white lie just to make them feel better or to get better? And my conversation back to him was, does that make it easier to do it again in the future? Like the first lie always leads to making it easier to tell a second lie. And I think as humans, when we're doing all of these things, it's important to remember, am I helping here, but what am I losing because of it? Or what sacrifices am I making? So if it's our family, I'd rather make less money and spend more time with the people that love me. And one of the things that we've talked about, and this is something that's an actionable step, but I think it's important. I think it's good for us to jump to it now. So Stephen Covey wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and his big visualization, or the little mental experiment he does in there, is imagine yourself at your funeral, and you've got someone there who's, you've got your mom, your dad, a coworker, your kids, someone that you played pickup basketball with, whatever. And all of them goes up to the podium. What do they say about you? And that is like, when you start thinking about that and you're like, what, my kids would say that I'm never around, or my brother would say that I was never kind. And I think that we can transition that into clinical care. What would my patients say about me? Would they say, oh, you know what, they threw a hot pack on me and they had somebody else do exercises with me? Or do they say, you know what, he was kind, he was empathetic, he listened to me when nobody else wanted to. He tried to answer my questions. He did his best to try and make me feel better, even when I was probably a complete jerk, or I made it difficult. That person was there for me for something more. And that's not easy. That is wicked hard. But I want people to say that about me. Would some people say that now? Probably not. I'm sure I've had some patients that probably hate me. But when you start reflecting on that, it changes things. Because when we're all on the ground, we're all on the ground. What do we leave behind is, well, he was a jerk and never spent time with me, or he cared about me more than just a number. And that's something that bothers me in healthcare, is we're so numbers driven. And I get the business side of it. This conversation really isn't going that direction. But like even now, I treat patients every 20 minutes. That doesn't mean I can't be kind to them or have humility towards them or try to level with them a little bit, right? So, just to go off what John said, that's really what we got to kind of figure out is, is it worth it to go this direction? Because what gets taken away because of that?
So how do you define ego? We've said the term a number of times now.
So I'm going to pull it from Ego is the Enemy, which is another great Ryan Holiday book. So he talks about it as an unhealthy belief in our own importance, arrogance, self-centered ambition. And I'll preface this by saying that ego, I would also put it on a spectrum. You have to have a little bit of it, but is it pushing you to the point, like having ego versus being completely just throw to the wind, whatever happens, like just always standoffish. Like there has to be a little bit of ambition there. You can't just lack ambition. But I think in the way that we're talking about it right now, again, it's an unhealthy belief in who we are.
Could it also be considered, and maybe this is in the same vein, as ego is kind of the sense of self, but you can inflate your sense of self by creating your narratives to be about you. So clinically, we talk about, are we doing this because it's what we think is best for the patient, or are we doing it for ourselves ultimately, or to get that little dopamine boost? Am I doing this fancy therapy because I like when they say, oh, that feels nice? Or am I doing it because I actually think it's going to drive some type of long-term thing to help them? So that's kind of how I conceptualize it. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Because I liked your piece, Jackson, where you said the ego itself is not, it's a spectrum. So the ego is just the thing. It's the inflation of such that can maybe get us in trouble.
Mm-hmm. I think that the way that we're going to talk about ego is in a negative way, because I think the other word that I'd almost replace that with confidence. I would almost say that ego is bad, confidence is good. But inflating the confidence in ourself is good. The self-validation of ourself is not so good. And I'll give you an example. So in that book, Ego is Enemy by Ryan Holiday, he talks about General, I think it's George Marshall from World War II. And he goes in to get his painting done, and he considers, like he talks about him in the book, just being a very magnanimous character. Like he doesn't take any credit for anything. And then Eisenhower gets all the credit. And this guy's just sitting in the background like, hey, it's okay. Well, they do this painting of him and he sits there and does it. And then he gets up and walks away. And the painter goes, don't you want to see it? He's like, no, why would I want to see it? And the purpose there is, or the point that they make is, it has nothing to do with, he's got better things to do than to look at himself. It's just a part of what they're doing. We have better, and we'll talk about the social media thing again, we have better things to do than validate ourselves and take a picture and do this and do that. Like, where else can my time be spent? And that's where ego gets in the way, is it basically tells us that we're, that we can't be broken, that we can't be brought down. I've made this money because I'm inherently great. Or, I've helped these patients because I am so awesome. And I've done all of these great things. I have all these letters after my name because I'm so intelligent. That's what ego tells us. Ego wants to convince us that we are something that we are not. When in fact, all that stuff can crumble down overnight. And it's amazing the humbling process that takes, as opposed to, oh, I'm so great because my patient is better. Well, maybe it just happened to be that 2 months passed and the regression to the mean occurred. Maybe your patient was going to get better no matter if you were there or not. That's where we have to check ego. And I'll say all this to say this too. It is not that we don't have ego. All of us have egos. We will all have egos. We all have biases. It's the appreciation that we have them and our ability to cope with them. It's not like we're trying to or just get rid of ego. Like, you can't just delete it, but you can appreciate it for what it is and tame it. That's what Stoic philosophy is basically all about, is kind of taming your passions, so to speak. Like, we all have these things that we get fired up about, but it's the ability to see past that. And that's really where ego comes in, is understanding that, we have this belief in ourselves that we're awesome. And sometimes that can be super beneficial, like picturing yourself, in 2 weeks, I've got this sprint triathlon. Like, there's plenty of times where I visualize like doing really well in my swim and doing well on the bike and getting on the run, and my legs are tired, but I go through it and I do it. There is a little bit of like, okay, my ego is telling me that I'm going to, go accomplish this. What I'm not saying is I'm the best. If I finish this, I'm somehow inherently great. No, that lacks the humility that you need.
One book that I've read recently, or actually listened to it, maybe that doesn't count as reading in some people's minds, but it was called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. It was actually about psychedelics and how they affect the brain. But
just like a Californian.
It's I've never taken part. But it was
Joe
interesting.
About to walk in the door.
Yeah, I know. But they're, we think about the word ego, and I don't necessarily think that Freud meant it in a negative fashion. It was just the I part of his tripartite model of the mind, the id, the ego, the superego. The ego was the I. And so what they've tried to define or see in regards to psychedelics and how it affects the brain is that the sense of I dissipates, or you have anxiety, or you have disorders like anxiety and depression where the sense of I is heightened. And there's a spectrum there. And I'm seeing connections with what we're talking about just for myself is the more I think about me, the more my sense of self, AKA ego, is inflated, the more I start to get wrapped up in some negative thought processes too. And it kind of feeds into itself. The more anxious I feel, the more I think about myself, and the more selfish I get, and then the less I have to give. So it is, I even think it's healthy to think of it as on a spectrum. We're healthcare providers. We're in a position of quote unquote authority. So there is some sense of power there, in a sense that we are the experts, and we can veto if we feel we have recommendations. And if our recommendations go against that of the patient, it's our responsibility if we feel that those recommendations are important. And so I think that ego is kind of a part of what we do on a daily basis to some extent, but it's at what end and what is the motive behind what you're saying in regards to the sense of self or the ego, kind of utilizing that for the good of the person in front of you, or utilizing it for your own personal gain. But probably not questions that can necessarily be answered, but just things to kind of think about internally.
Well, I can give you an example that I talked to John about last week, because I know a big part of this is being able to, how do you apply this crap? Like, oh, ego, that's all good and well, and character and integrity, but like, it's all kind of just words until you find ways to apply it. So, case study from, right now I'm treating a kid who's he had an anterior Bankart. He had a surgery before that was botched, and then had some bad PT, and so his shoulder's jacked up. So he came in day one, mom comes with him, and immediately the minute mom walks in, the word helicopter is just like spinning over her head. Like this, it's one of those situations where she speaks for him. He's got no voice. He's like 14 years old. And I'm like, oh, great. Just like all of us do. We're like, all right, whatever. So we come in, we start talking. This kid is like, wouldn't move his shoulder. He's like 3 weeks post-op, and I could like touch the side of his arm, and it was like the worst thing ever. Like guarded, he just held his arm stiff, like couldn't do anything, couldn't move it. He was terrified. He wouldn't do anything. And so the whole time I was telling mom, I was like, hey, we're going to try and move this thing. We have a protocol. I've spoken to the surgeon. Like, this is what we're going to do. And so like a month went by. I think right now he's at like 2 months, whatever it is. And I'm looking through my notes before I see this kid that day. I just saw him on Thursday, and this is the following Tuesday. And I see a note from a PA. So after his Thursday appointment, they went to the urgent care because he was in excruciating pain in his shoulder, and his mom was like terrified, immediately brought him to the urgent care, like huge deal, huge ordeal. I had this huge long note about how the therapist is pushing him too hard and they're working all this stuff. And so I'm reading this note, and in my own mind, all I want to do is just like, I'm MFing this kid and his mom. I'm like, this kid is acting like a little biatch. Like, he doesn't want to move his shoulder. Mom is sitting there just holding him down. Like, she's in control of all this. Every time she says something, he does it. Like, all these things are spinning in my head. And I found myself getting like worked up, because we've all done that. We've had patients say stuff about us or that we're doing something wrong. And meanwhile, this kid's like 3 weeks behind his protocol. Like, we're at like 30 degrees of flexion, and he's supposed to be at like 160 or something. And so like all we're doing is nothing during treatment. And I'm thinking of all this stuff, but I realized in that moment, my ego was through the roof, because I was blaming them entirely. I was like, it's this kid's fault. It's this mom's fault. It's all about them. And then, and the problem with that is that solves nothing. And I kind of sat there and was like, you know what, this is a great moment. And I think I told you guys this you ever see the movie, why am I blanking? Oh, Bruce Almighty. You ever seen that, Quinn? So we talked about this last time. So there's a moment in that where, Morgan Freeman as God says, when we pray for, courage, do we just get given courage or do we get opportunities to be courageous? And I felt that in that moment. I was kind of like, okay, this is an opportunity for me to put my ego aside. What can I do in this situation to make it better? Do I need to apologize? Do I need to assess things? What can I do for this kid? Because he's still coming in to see me. It's my job as a clinician to put my crap to the side and what can I do to help him? And how can I handle mom? Maybe I need to have her sit outside during treatments. Maybe I need to have dad. I don't know what it is, but I had to put aside my problems. I know, because I was too good. There's no way that I did anything wrong. Maybe I did bother his shoulder. Maybe I need to come at it from a different angle, but I was pushing it on them immediately. And I think that as clinicians is where we need to check our egos is, sometimes it may not be our fault, but we can always change something about what we're doing to help somebody else. If they chose to go somewhere else, that's totally fine. But what can I do to make myself better from it? We choose that. It's Viktor Frankl talks about between the stimulus and the response, we have the freedom to choose. The stimulus was this kid was pissed and mom was pissed or his shoulder was whatever. And between the response of what happens is what I do. Am I going to have them come in and just not care about this kid? Am I going to be like, well, you know what? You're way behind. So sucks to suck. We're going to have to move this thing really hard. And, this just, whatever, suck it up. And then watch mom freak out. Or do I need to look at her and be like, hey, you're being a helicopter mom. Why don't you get the hell out of my clinic? And because that's what I really wanted to do at first, because I felt attacked. But that's the total opposite of what we're supposed to do. That won't benefit them at all. So as a clinical example, which maybe you guys have others like that hit me hard because it wasn't that in that moment I was like very stoic and calm and like, oh, I'm going to handle this well. I was friggin' pissed, but I had to check myself. Again, it's my ego existed, but did I try to tame it? But as that happens more, I feel like we get better at it. I still suck at it, but that's one more example I can use and one more time that my brain gets used to. This is a better way to handle it. Now, 2 weeks later from that, the kid's doing fantastic. He's got back to full range of motion. The strength looks better. And I don't want to say it's because I did it, but I think if I'd gone the other route, he'd be going somewhere else. And that doesn't benefit him or me. So that's one of those big ego checks to just keep in mind as clinicians.
Yeah, I'll chime in too. That definitely happens to me, whether it's a situation in the clinic or whether someone online says something either about me directly or about an idea or something with which I identify and I take that, or the visceral reaction is taking that as a personal attack. Another book that you've got in your list is Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, and that's been, without any exaggeration, pretty a life-changing read or listen, Quinn, for me too, because I got that in audiobook format. But the idea, there's a lot of nuance that goes into it, but the idea of extreme ownership, as Jocko and Leif put it out there, is that leaders will take ownership for everything in their world. And again, I wanted to preface it by saying there's nuance because there are some things that we have no control over. You get sick. You didn't necessarily get yourself sick, but you do have the responsibility as far as how you're going to respond to that sickness or what you're going to be doing in that situation. And so it'll continue to be a process for me. But probably one of the most telling things has been my wife telling me on a couple of occasions, maybe more than a couple, that she's noticed a drastic change in how I approach situations, even if we're arguing about something or discussing something that's a little contentious or in the past would have resulted in a big blow up or something. She's noticed that I'll step back and detach a little bit better and be able to recognize that. Even if there are things going on that I don't necessarily like, it's still my responsibility to make sure that I communicate well and that we take actions that ultimately result in the things that we want to have happen. And it's not easy. But that, again, I talked about a paradigm shift earlier. This has been another one, or maybe part of the same paradigm shift for me. is just viewing everything as, if it's anybody's fault, it's mine. So how then can I change? How can I be better to try to serve this person or these people better? And I'm not great at it. It's a hard thing. It requires a lot of time and conscious effort. But then, doing things or taking actions like maybe pulling back a little bit from how involved with social media or other draining activities that I've previously engaged in, maybe that gives me a little bit more gas in the tank to direct towards these other things, which to me are more meaningful.
I agree with that. And I think one of the things that clinically I've used for a while in a similar situation, I think all of us have been in that situation that Jackson has, is to ask myself up front, how did we get here? And not just evaluate like, okay, well, the mom's a helicopter mom and the kid doesn't speak for himself, but also, okay, so what did I do to foster that behavior or allow that to continue? Or what are things that I didn't say? Or did I say things that weren't clear enough? Like, that's one thing that I know is a huge fault of mine, is I'll say something and it's a known to me, but it's an unknown to them. So you have to say it multiple times in different types of formats, and I'll just assume that I got my point across. And then I'll go back and I'll be like, well, obviously because of the result of where we are now, I didn't communicate effectively, or I didn't fully flesh out that conversation or have the difficult conversation that I needed to have. And by starting off with that question, it's helped me evaluate that stuff. And it's made my relationship with my wife better. She'll get angry or upset about something. I'll be like, okay, hold on. How did we get here? Oh, it's because I didn't tell her that I wasn't able to pick up the kids today. Like little stuff. Mm-hmm. And it allows you to step back for a second and shelve that ego to the side a little bit and say, okay, wait a second. What personal stake did I have in this result? How could I have done differently? And what can I do now to rectify that problem?
Hey guys, Quinn here. Consider this a little brain break from the existential crisis that you're probably in from our conversation with Jackson Taylor. We'll get back to that in just a second. We wanted to let you know that we will be looking to begin scheduling our 2020 weightlifting and powerlifting certifications. So if you know of a willing facility who would like to host a Clinical Athlete Barbell certification, have them email events@clinicalathlete.com with a subject line of seminar host, and we will send all details. And one more quick announcement. We have recently launched the Clinical Athlete coaching program in which myself, John Flagg, and Jared Maynard are head coaches. So if you're an athlete or know of any athletes in need of coaching to be able to get back to or surpass their previous performance goals, head over to clinicalathlete.com for details. And now back to the show. Jackson, how do you define empathy? Because it's really what we're talking about here is regards to a quality that a clinician should exude as they're interacting with the person in front of them. How do you define that, and what do you think empathy's role is for the clinician?
So empathy is there's a lot of ways to define it. Between empathy and sympathy, I think, is the big difference that we always get. Like, well, I'm sympathetic towards them. Are you empathetic towards them? So when I define empathy, and again, other people may look at this different, I'm really looking at, am I able to objectively, which is impossible, put myself in somebody else's shoes? Because, if you or John or Jared are going through something, like I'm not married. I'll give that example. So Jared's going through something with his wife. I may not know what that's like from like an actual, I've been there, done that. Like I haven't practiced those things, but I can empathize with him going, if I was him, what would I feel? Or what do I think I would feel? How would I do that? And it's really putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but in a way that is objective as possible. So I'll give the example of like a patient comes in. I had a patient the other day. They came in because their back hurt and they've seen a bunch of people. They've had a bunch of injections. They had someone tell them that their spine was malaligned and all these things. And as a clinician, I get super tired of hearing that. And I'm like, why are we screwing people over so bad and how we're speaking to them about these things. Like, but that's not my patient's fault. So if I was that patient and someone had told me, hey, if we put this injection in your back, you're going to feel better. Or, hey, your spine's out of line. If we put it back in place, you're going to feel better. If you've been told that narrative 100 times and I just go, you know what, that's a bunch of crap. It's, your back's fine. Like, let's go do some exercises or, let's get you working out. I have totally missed the fact that I am not empathizing with them. I can sympathize and be like, oh, well, that super sucks. But I'm not thinking to myself, if I was that person looking at me right now, and I told them that they were just full of crap and that all the stuff they just told me has nothing to do with anything. It's really that me just attacking them for no reason. It doesn't do me any good. It doesn't do them any good. So when we empathize with people, it's kind of putting on like the emotions they may be experiencing, but from 10,000 feet. It's, if I was them, what do I need right now? And I can give that same example about the kid with the bank cart repair. If I was that kid and mom was treating me this way and I was coming here and I'm being rushed here and there, what am I thinking? And am I going to be accurate in that? Hell no, because I'm not that kid and I'm not anybody else. But the attempt to try and do that at some cost to myself is true empathy. Is it going to cost me some time and effort and putting my ego aside to really benefit somebody else regardless? And I think I put in there a quote. So Jamil Zaki wrote a book called The War on Kindness, which I finished up recently. Super good book, but the whole book's about empathy. And I think he puts empathy's most important role, though, is to inspire kindness, our tendency to help each other, even at a cost to ourselves. That really puts empathy in its best light. And I know all of us have experienced that, and I have sucked at empathizing. Because sometimes you're just like, dude, come on. Like, I've had chronic back pain for 30 years, like, whoop-de-doo. And is there something to say that we need to be able to kind of gauge that? Like, how far can I push this person? How far can I not? Sure. But I still got to be able to try to see things from where they are. Otherwise, I can't help them.
A couple things you said there, empathy being as best we can an objective thing, but stepping into somebody's shoes, but from a 10,000 foot view, which is kind of a paradox. But I think people get mixed up into a dichotomy of, I either have to be stone cold and cold hearted, or I can be empathetic. But if I'm empathetic, I can only take on somebody's emotions for so long before I get drained. But that's not necessarily what empathy is. You're not necessarily taking somebody else's emotions on. You're trying to look at the situation from their worldview. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take it on yourself, because that is what I think maybe runs people's down. Am I understanding that concept?
1,000%. That is because there's actually a book that talks about the downsides of empathy. And that's one of the downsides, is that we get so involved. And we all, I've had people in my own life who, some family in, Europe loses their son and they're distraught, and it's not to say that that's not a tragedy, but they become so heavily involved in what's happening outside of themselves that they can't control it. They lose control of like who they are, So you're exactly right in saying that it's got nothing to do with the fact that you want to take on their emotions, but again, it's almost in an objective manner. Like, if I was them, what would I feel? And what would because again, we're also not experiencing what they are. So that gives us a little bit more of an objective piece, because, they may be feeling sad. And how do I equate to that? Have I had situations in my own life where I've felt these things, and what did I look for? What did I want? What helped me? Those are questions that are hard to ask. And especially in a, 30-minute treatment, how do you put all that in your brain and then spit something out to them that's actually effective? Practice plays a big role in that. But you're very right. It's not about just getting so involved in them that you're like, oh my gosh, they're going downhill. As practitioners, we do have to have a sense of, kind of objective realism to the fact that, I'm going to help them as best I can. But if I can't see what they're seeing, try to. I really can't help them. And again, you're just going to see the whole process of, well, let's go put them on a hot pack, and, maybe we'll keep the ultrasound machine off, and, put that on them, and they might get better, but then they're going to be back in 4 months because all you did was screw them over more.
Well, at least you saved electricity by giving them ultrasound without it turned on.
Definitely save the clinic some money.
Yeah. Are you seeing trends? Because we got some notes here. We always, have some talking points before the show, and there's actually a little bit of evidence showing empathy is decreasing in the field. And we cited a study looking at med students, and I've actually heard this study cited in a number of books, in that over the course of med school, students rate themselves as less empathetic kind of as the process goes on. It's almost like they've just kind of been beaten down into submission. Can you talk a little bit about the trends that we're seeing in that regard?
Yeah, I know the one paper that I cited actually came from that book, but it was basically saying that people in 2009, again, this is all based on, research done with kids filling out surveys. So, how accurate all of it is, but I think we can all agree on a lot of this stuff. People in 2009 were 75% less empathetic than in 1979, looking at college students, so, and again, maybe that's a sliding scale. Maybe it could be as high as 90, maybe it could be as low as 50, but 50% is a lot when you consider that long term. And I'll even look at it for myself when I was in grad school. We're taught this very, I guess I'll say biomedical approach to patients. Oh, well, you have a tendinopathy. We're going to do this, and this. And I think what empathy does is it adds the human. We so often forget that what we're treating is a human, and we talk about this all the time. That's why the biopsychosocial models become such a big thing. Is it's not a machine. But even with people saying that all these days, I think we're still missing the fact that you're right, their brains are involved. But we've still made it biomedical by saying, well, you know what, pain comes from here, and nociception isn't really pain reception. It's this. We're still pointing at mechanical things and forgetting it's a human. That's what empathy does, is it reminds you that this is a person. So, from way back then to even through grad school for me, I noticed myself becoming less empathetic in some ways because I was treating everybody as a disorder or as a disease or as a knee replacement, or as opposed to, no, I'm treating, John, it's a person. Yes, there's got some stuff going on, but that's what empathy does. I think it bridges that gap between, that biomedical and that biopsychosocial model, is the ability to see that it's a human. And over time, myself, and maybe you guys can attest to that, or at least that's what we're taught. I didn't take a class in grad school about, being a good person as a clinician. Took a lot of classes about biomedical stuff and how to use my hands, and we had like 18 steps at my school of how to, treat a patient, but there wasn't any of those steps that said empathize. That didn't make the list. So we're not taught those things. So you can imagine, especially as you go through medical school or PT school, some of those things just, you're not going to get good at because you don't practice. That's not a part of it. I mean, I can tell you that a lot of the kids in my class, they were real smart. They could ace every test. But when they had to get in front of a person who was distraught or crying or whatever, you're like, what do I do? And we've all been there before in some way, right? So, but that's not something that's taught. So I think if we're talking about school specifically, that is a huge lacking component. I think Level Up's doing a good job right now of talking about a lot of the research stuff and ClinicalAthlete and, even barbell medicine, places like that, where it's like we got to talk about all the stuff, but we're still forgetting that you're treating humans, and we have to learn how to handle that. It's almost like we need psychology for healthcare professionals. Like that needs to be a class that's taught, outside of, instead of us teaching classes on like, I had a critical thinking class that literally, the only critical thinking I had to do was like open Blackboard and click yes to a couple questions and close it. There's so much things that we waste time on where we could be spending time learning how to treat people better, and I think that some of that does come down to ourselves learning how to, helping ourselves or self-managing how we can be better as clinicians, but sometimes, you need to learn those things. I would love to see universities that taught a class and see how that changes. Like how the Naval College teaches a philosophy class on it's like this huge class that people love. And it totally changes people's perspective on how they handle the world and war and, that stuff. Like, what if PT schools taught that? I would sign up for that class immediately,
You mentioned earlier in the conversation the funeral visualization by Stephen Covey, kind of the idea of what would people say about me in my funeral. Do you have any other actionable steps that people can take, new grads or young students looking to find their way in order to better reflect on their character and kind of their path?
Sure. For me, I used to always be like, I had to have like things, like I had to have like something I was striving for, or, these are the things that define me and yada, yada. But one of the things I started learning is that one of the best things I ever did for myself, which was also told to me from when I was a kid and I just never did it because I was like, that's whatever, is writing it down. So like every day I journal about the day, either that night or the next morning, I write about that day. And it might not have anything to do with PT. It might, like I wrote about that kid in my journal a couple weeks ago and like trying in my own mind to put that down. But that's one of those things that it forces you to reflect on what you did. And I will honestly say that I put that off for years because I was so scared of writing it down, because it challenged my ego. It made me feel as if, if I write this down, does it make it more real? Do I really, because you have to sit there and look at yourself like, today I did this. Was that right? Is that something that I need to work on? And you've got all these people across, so I'll give you the example of Marcus Aurelius, greatest Roman emperor ever, probably one of the greatest leaders ever. His book Meditations is him like quarreling with himself about how to be a better man. It was just his journal, but they published it as a book. But in doing so, it makes you better at whatever you do. So, I would say that journaling is one of the greatest things people can do. And journaling, or even saying it into a microphone, I don't know, if you don't like writing, type it. Whatever it does, if you never reflect on what you're doing, how can you ever move forward? Because you're not making any decisions on what you did in the past. So that's one of my big things is the funeral visualization is awesome. And then write down what those people would say. I would say journaling every day, and do that for like a month. Like journal every day, or try to, and then go back and read it. What did you learn about yourself? Are you more shallow than you thought? And be honest, no one's going to read your journal. That's one of the other things I always find myself doing is like, I'm writing something down and being like, ooh, I hope nobody reads this. But, no one cares about stealing Jackson Taylor's journal. Like, it's not like it's going to be headline news anytime soon. But again, my ego might tell me it is, like, oh my God, they might know that I cried last night. It's just one of those things that we get through. But be honest with yourself. Like, I was an asshole today at work. And this is how I feel about it right now. Or even if you're taking the concept of like you with a spouse, like my wife and I had a blowout fight last night. And now that I've had time to reflect on it, this is the things that I did wrong. What can I do better? How can I handle the situation? Because if you just do it in your mind, it's going to go away. Because our memory is based on how we feel right now, not on how we felt then. So it's important to get those things down, I think, quickly, because it allows us to be more objective in what we're saying. After doing that for a month, I think then it's the time to see what areas in my life do I really care about, and what things, like having your core values. So like my core values, one of which is my family. Because when I start writing, I write a lot about my family. Like missing them, being a part of them, what kind of legacy do I want to leave my little sister? What have I learned? The other night I wrote about, what I learned from my godfather and how important he is to me. And, things like that, you start seeing patterns, like at work. If you're being a jerk, obviously work's important, healthcare is important. Do you talk about the gym when you journal? Do you talk about your kids? Do you, what is in there? And establish it. So, my character is important to me. My integrity is important to me. My humility is important to me. How often am I being something I'm not? And I think once you start seeing kind of what you write down and you develop this list of kind of core values or virtues, if you want to call it such, you then reflect your life on those things. So like, for instance, my family is one of mine. When I make a decision, it's important to me that I think to myself, when I make this decision, what would my little sister think of me? Would it positively affect her? Would my godparents be proud of me if I made this decision? And again, you're not going to bat 100% here. In fact, you're going to bat like 200% if you're lucky, or 20% if you're lucky. We're not going to be good at it. But if you're not reflecting on it, that makes a big difference. if I'm treating a patient, in humility and, putting my ego to the side, my character is important to me. Am I going to lie to them about what this treatment does? If I think about it, that affects my character. That lessens me as a person. I don't want to do that. I'd rather take the harder road than take the easy road, but detract from my character any day of the week, because at least I can look at myself at night and know that I was bigger than my ego. So if you want to take actionable steps, I think those are, they are super hard, because you have to look at yourself in a way that's, you're kind of a piece of crap. But how can your piece of crap become better? And that's a hard thing to do. And every day I think of myself like, you know what, maybe I'm great, or maybe I'm good at this, or I'm this, and that. And then I'm like, you know what, I'm not. And that's okay. But am I benefiting? Am I reflecting my values in the things that I do? Like even earlier when I was trying to write something for you guys in a bio, I was like, oh, I could talk about all this stuff that I've done and all this stuff that I've done, and I've done this, and I was like, but do I really need to? Is that necessary, or does that detract from who I am as a person? And I think that if we can start, those are hard questions. There's no easy way to have them, but again, the more you do it, the better you get at it. So I would start there, and my number one piece of advice is to read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I think everyone should read that book. I know it says Man's Search for Meaning, but it's not about men and women. It's just, just read the book and take in the fact that those are things. When you start reading about somebody who's having conversations in his mind with his wife, who he doesn't know if he's alive or not, and she's been dead for months, and that's how he gets by. Or you start talking about him helping people when, they're walking through these fields at -2 degrees or whatever it is, and they're plugging on because it's important for him to live. You start reevaluating what's important in life. And so I always recommend that every student athlete I talk to, I'm like, eventually, you're not going to pick it up immediately and read it. And it's hard to read sometimes, but as clinicians, I think that's a great book, and I think I gave y'all a list of kind of books that I like, and you're welcome to share that out. It's not like it's a secret list, but that's stuff that I think is beneficial, that helps people. And yeah, that's that.
Well, this has been really awesome, man. This is a great conversation. We're going to put that list of books in the show notes. And where can people find you? Where can they connect with you if they want to talk a little bit about this stuff a little bit more?
Well, that's a good question. So I like I said, I've kind of jumped off of the social media wagon the last couple of months. I still have my social media. It's jacksontaylor.dpt. So if you have questions on there, you're welcome to send me a message, or, I love emailing people because I think it's just more personal. If someone has a problem with me, I love it when they email me because it's just me and them. It's just we can talk it out. So my email is jackson@anchorforge.com. So people want to reach out to me there, go for it. I love these kind of conversations. Even when I've talked to John and Jared before, just Skyping, just to you're just talking shop. I think these are the kind of things that people should do more often, is find groups of 3 or 4 or 5 people and just kind of hash stuff out. So I'm happy to do that with anybody. I think that's a great way to learn. You learn a lot during podcasts like this, and, I think it's just a good way for us to do it. So if you want to find me, I'll respond eventually.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, man. This was great. I think people are going to get a lot out of it.
I hope so. I appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much. Quinn, keep doing the good work, man. It's not easy to keep up with all this stuff and get good information out and do it professionally. And Clinical Athlete's done a better job than most people I've ever seen do it. So appreciate it.
Well, we appreciate that, man. We'll keep at it. Thank you.
Oh.
John and Jared, thanks as always.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Enjoy your 60-degree weather, Quinn.
I will. Thank you to our 5 listeners.
Appreciate you guys.
Okay. All right.
See you guys.
We We'd like to thank Jackson Taylor for being on the show. You can check out the show notes for links to Jackson's contact info and for his recommended book list. And of course, thank you to my homies, Jared Maynard and John Flagg, for steering the ship alongside me. And thank you, the Clinical Athlete community, all 6 of you, for joining us on this journey of improved knowledge and practice in both the gym and clinic. If you want to dive even deeper into this community, you can check out all that the Clinical Athlete Forum has to offer, which includes our Clinical Athlete Academy courses, amazing discussions and networking with professional clinicians and coaches, as well as students, and just our overall hub of knowledge in regards to athlete health and performance. Thanks, everyone, and talk to you soon.